At the heart of every main Zelda game are the dungeons. Whether they're massive temples, hidden caverns, or great forces of nature, these giant areas serve as the main attraction to your stay. It's often here that you'll tackle traps, find new items, and unlock whatever magic MacGuffin you need 8 or so of to save the world. It's also often here that you'll tear your hair out, because dungeons can get pretty frustrating pretty quickly. Today, I'll be going through my personal 10 least favorite dungeons over the course of the main Zelda titles. Just as a quick note, I decided to leave mini-bosses and bosses out of consideration for my enjoyability of each dungeon, but instead to just focus on the puzzles and rooms of each area. Also, this is just my personal list of least favorites, and just because I didn't like a dungeon personally, doesn't mean that it can't still be one of your favorites. With that out of the way, let's explore the top 10 places in Zelda I hate exploring.
Number 10.
City in the Sky, Twilight Princess. City in the Sky is a tough one for me because it contains one of my favorite extensions to one of my favorite Zelda items. I love the hookshot to death, and the idea of becoming Spider Link with the double claw shots is awesome. In some areas of City in the Sky, it feels fantastic to quickly bounce from point to point using this new item. Unfortunately, a vast majority of this dungeon is spent waiting. Just waiting. Waiting a year to ride the P-Hat Express, or sitting latched to a panel hoping to finally connect with the next one. Or just sitting forever waiting for the game to tell you that your claw shot can in fact connect with something else in range. It's a very slow dungeon, and I get it. It's kind of what they're going for, with the music and atmosphere giving you the impression of a bizarre, ancient, and abandoned land. But I can't help but think that this dungeon feels about twice as long as it should be, without anything fun or interesting during those long waits with zero interaction. Entire map to his digestive tract. Suspension of disbelief aside, Jabu Jabu's belly is just plain disgusting. Even some of my least favorite areas in Zelda at least come with some beautiful scenery to look at, but Jabu Jabu is nothing but gross, pink, pulsing organ walls. We're not off to a great start. It might even be deserving of a spot of its own, just based on how unsightly it is, but Jabu Jabu does us one better by introducing everyone's favorite mechanic, an escort mission featuring the most snooty and ungrateful partner of all time, Princess Ruto. She pouts, demands that you carry her on your back, and if she falls or you leave the room without her, you have to trek all the way back to her spawn room to reclaim her. It's one thing to babysit, but when they blame you the whole way through, yeah, it doesn't really encourage me to continue through the dungeon. In general, most of the dungeons on this list aren't very difficult, but it's definitely a big chunk of my Ocarina of Time playthrough that I'm not thrilled to revisit. Oh yeah, and she can drown, but she's a Zora. It doesn't even make sense. It's not like I like you or anything. Oh my god, Ruto, is this you? Did you make this subreddit?
Number 8.
The Forsaken Fortress, Wind Waker. Wind Waker is such a crazy mix for me. The atmosphere, energy, characters, and open world make it one of the most memorable Zelda games of all time for me, but man does it have some bad pacing, and nothing kills my mood in a new playthrough more than this first trip to the Forsaken Fortress. Does that count? Is that a dungeon? I mean, there's a map and a compass and a boss and stuff later, so I'm gonna go ahead and make that stretch. It's really early in the game, you just got your first taste of the sword, your sister was kidnapped, you fired yourself out of a cannon for revenge, and they take your sword away for a big... Isn't normally about stealth? I usually hate them. And Forsaken Fortress is much bigger than a minigame. Do you like slowly shuffling around in a barrel? Because if so, you're gonna love this opening Wind Waker segment. My favorite part is when the mice can take you out of your barrel, and then you get cooked alive. That's good. There's a point toward the middle where you learn about Wind Waker's amazing feature to steal certain enemy weapons and use them against their wielders. Oh, this is awesome! I get it now. I take the weapon with me into the stealth areas, and then I use it to fight back against the mob. Link, what are you doing? No, Link, you left your sword out and... back to the barrels. It isn't incredibly long, but it's a major buzzkill to essentially kick off your adventure. The only thing that saves this segment for me is your second trip there, which is a little bit more exciting.
Number 7.
Turtle Rock, Link's Awakening. Turtle Rock is the final dungeon in Link's Awakening, and it is by far the longest. Despite this, the dungeon is very uninteresting, and so non-linear that it actually becomes a problem. There are so many little nagging things that always pile up when I revisit this game. The huge amount of underground passages makes this map extremely hard to follow. There are so many keys in this dungeon. Back when I first played this game and the internet was young, there were actually a lot of rumors that there was a route you could take that would leave you unable to find any additional keys, stuck forever and forcing you to replay the entire game. Years later, I think there was another hidden bombable wall that was eventually shared online, but the fact that players actually got stuck without being able to finish the game is a testament to just how confusing the layout can be. My least favorite part is an enemy that you have to fight, only to realize that the chest spawns in a place that you can't reach. So you have to leave and refight the boss on top of a ledge just to get a chest at the same time. Come on, man.
Number 6.
The Water Temple, Ocarina of Time. What? Jaywitz, how can you have the Water Temple at number 6? It is clearly the worst temple of all time. Have you not read the memes? Oh, don't worry, I still don't like the Water Temple, but after playing through this temple around 20 plus times over the course of my life, I think my hatred has been dulled just a little. The biggest problem with what I actually think is a cool level design with awesome atmosphere is that it's just so boring. You know the drill. Raise the water and lower the water by playing a song on your ocarina a dozen plus times. Drop into the sea with your iron boots through the pause menu. Select, unpause, oh wait, I need to swim now, so pause, turn the boots off, unpause, and oh, now we need to put them back on to get back on the floor, so boots back on, pause, boots, oh. I think at face value, there are potentially good puzzles here. But good Goddesses of the Triforce, it is one of the slowest and most tedious ways to present some good puzzles. The absolute worst part is the key. Everybody's got that one key that you always forget to grab. Mine's this one right here. But the dungeon's design doesn't let you know that you're missing a key until you're in way too deep. It's not the worst dungeon ever, but it might be the worst dungeon ever to backtrack, forcing you to lower and raise water as you trek through every corner of the place just to figure out where you were supposed to go first. The 3DS version very thankfully gave us the ability to equip the iron boots as a sea item, which might be why I haven't been as enraged in my last few visits to Waterworld. They also give you color-coordinated doors to the water levels, which I'm not even sure was needed. But ultimately, even those fixes can't save the fact that this dungeon bores me to tears.
Number 5.
The Great Bay Temple, Majora's Mask. Why is it always the water? I've touched on this before, but I think Majora's Mask has my favorite overworld and side quests of any Zelda game. But outside of the challenging but rewarding Stone Tower Temple, I am not a big fan of most of Majora's Mask dungeons. The Great Bay Temple, much like the dreaded Ocarina of Time Water Temple, is built entirely around a large underwater mechanic. This time, and while this is certainly outside of the genre, a factory might be the best description for Great Bay. There are multiple cogs and pieces you need to understand in order to move forward in Great Bay, and growing up especially, I had a nightmare trying to remember which currents needed to be active or which water to freeze in order to move from one point to another. Much like the Water Temple, if you missed something you were looking for in the original current, it's a pain to make your way all the way back and reset everything to normal. This pain is compounded even further if you're looking to collect all of the hidden fairies as well, which are in some pretty obscure spots. I just have never had a good time in this dungeon. I hate the controls for swimming, and when almost every room is connected to the next one underwater, it just leaves me dizzy. There are visual cues through colored pipes throughout the dungeon to help you figure some of the water sources, but even today, when I actually understand the dungeon and where to go, I just never have any fun with it. Another thing that used to be a problem for me was Majora's 3-day time limit, which usually never seems to push me that hard in the other dungeons, but in Great Bay, it used to creep up on me if I forgot where all the fairies were, and if you run out of time, you have to redo everything. It's a combination of pressure, swimming, and a confusing map that keep Great Bay from being my Great Bay.
Number 4.
Death Mountain, Legend of Zelda. Death Mountain, also known as Level 9, carries a lot of the issues I had with Turtle Rock. It makes sense. Both are the final dungeon, both are 2D top-down Zeldas, and both dungeons are extremely large and full of secret paths and bombable walls. Death Mountain steps these things up in two big ways. The first is simply that Death Mountain is crawling with the game's hardest enemies, including all flavors of Wizrobes, Like-Likes, and the new obnoxious Patra enemy. I found that this original Zelda game usually gives me more trouble with its random enemies than the bosses themselves, and Death Mountain is crawling with randoms. It's called Death Mountain for a reason. Just look at it. The map's a giant skull.
Skull?
The The other thing that has me salty to this day is that there are 2 hidden items in this dungeon, and one of them is absolutely required in order to beat the game, the Silver Arrow. My first time through this dungeon, I grabbed what I assumed was the only hidden item, the Red Ring, fought my way to Ganon, and found him completely and utterly undefeatable. I tried every weapon combo, I couldn't figure it out. The game manual hints that Ganon has a weak point, but I couldn't find anywhere where that point was revealed. Ultimately, I blame some of my problems on the game's localization. In the Japanese version, one old man says to look for the arrows at Death Mountain, while the English version says nothing like this. Only through word of mouth through a friend did I finally learn about the secret of the Silver Arrow. I know I said bosses wouldn't be a factor for these dungeons, but ultimately it was this cluttered and confusing dungeon that let me down. Death Mountain lives up to its name, and that isn't even including the second quest.
Number 3.
Jabu Jabu's Belly, Oracle of Ages. We have a lot of water levels today, but this is the true trash tier water level to rule them all. Ironically, it's once again a Jabu Jabu's Belly dungeon, except this one does not have the same issues that we saw in Ocarina of Time. It does have one thing in common with Ocarina of Time though. It borrows everyone's favorite mechanic, raising and lowering the water level throughout the dungeon. However, since this is a 2D top-down Zelda, changing the water level often completely changes what rooms you're visiting look like. In 3D, it's at least conceivable to see what happens when the water goes up and down, but in Oracle of Ages, the 2D vertical design feels like complete trial and error. It is so easy to get lost, and extremely common to retread your exact same steps over and over and over again until you realize the key was hidden because you weren't standing in the right place or you didn't even count when it comes to Zelda dungeons. I get that Zelda 2 is so fundamentally different from the other exploration-based Zelda titles, but do you see this map? Looks Zelda enough for me. The Great Palace is the final step of the road in Link's adventure, and it knows no mercy. It's a huge twisting trail of all kinds of garbage, including invisible floors, invisible walls, the hardest and most relentless enemies in the game, lava that will kill you in one hit, enemies that will hit you into the lava that will kill you in one hit, surprise ambushes, secret paths to progress forward. There's so much. It's a massive, molten mess. And even though it's one of the only levels in this game with a checkpoint, it's still one of the most common ways I've lost all of my lives. Oh hey guys, Ganon's back. And you know what? He earned it this time. I'm not even mad. The Great Palace was definitely the hardest Legend of Zelda challenge I've ever had the misfortune to face. However, it just barely isn't my least favorite, because that honor goes to...
Number 1.
Temple of the Ocean King, Phantom Hourglass. Despite this list being filled with dungeons that annoy me, the truth is that I really love all the games that I've talked about today, because for the most part, one annoying dungeon isn't enough to kill a great Zelda game. The Temple of the Ocean King, however, is a different kind of beast. When it comes to Phantom Hourglass, Temple of the Ocean King is nearly a third of the entire game. Like most of the dungeons on this list, the core concept isn't terrible. It's a gauntlet of decent puzzles and utilizes every item that you gain in your inventory. On its own, that sounds like a fantastic endgame dungeon. Sign me up! So where does it go wrong? Lots of little things that add up into one big monster. Problem 1 is the timer. Occasionally, Zelda games have timed puzzles that you need to finish before a switch resets, but hardly ever is an entire dungeon putting you on the clock. We touched on this a little bit with Great Bay, but typically Zelda games are all about exploring the caverns and temples, uncovering every puzzle and treasure hidden within the walls. The timer is generous enough to let you solve the dungeon when you know what you're doing, and there are plenty of ways to refill your time, but it's definitely not very Zelda-like, and it's bound to frustrate in the beginning. Problem 2 is the atmosphere. Nearly the entire dungeon plays around a stealth mechanic. The Phantom Guards can kill Link in a single swing, dropping 30 seconds of your timer and sending you back to the beginning of a room. We also touched on this in a past level of the Forsaken Fortress, but I'm just not big on stealth in Zelda games, so the idea of sprinting from safe zone to safe zone while hiding from patrols doesn't really do much for me. So take those two things and combine them, and we have an annoying temple, but not necessarily broken. Maybe that would hit the bottom of my top 10. But what really breaks it for me, and most players who dislike this dungeon, is my third problem with it. You have to go back through this dungeon half a dozen times. Every time you finish a major segment of the game, you trek back to the Temple of the Ocean King from the beginning, only to push slightly farther forward each time with new items. Eventually you hit a halfway point that saves your time and you can just jump to that for your last few tries, but it doesn't change the fact that you have to redo the same puzzles over and over again. Sometimes your new items create shortcuts that allow you to skip rooms, but other times you're doing the exact same room multiple times throughout different parts in your journey. It isn't until the final time you enter this dungeon that you can actually kill the phantoms regularly, and even then you have to do it in stealth when their backs are turned to you.
That's a real popular
Dungeon.
Who wants to
Play through it
50 times more?
Even with the shortcuts, I've never found it fun, and it becomes a chore. You can't go out and explore the seas and other fun dungeons until you finish your Ocean King homework, and it sucks. It's the central focus of the game. It's literally the reason this game has the title that it does. The Phantom Hourglass is the timer. The other DS Zelda game, Spirit Tracks, adds its own version of the Ocean King with the Tower of Spirits, another mega temple that you need to visit over and over. It's really tough, and a lot of people don't like this one either, but they improved on Ocean King's design in every way. It doesn't have a timer, you never have to repeat the same level, and you actually have a method of defeating and even utilizing the phantoms. And so, when Phantom Hourglass continually forces me to relive the same scenario over and over again, all while combining multiple elements that I already didn't like in other Zelda dungeons, it remains my least favorite Zelda dungeon of all time. Even though today was about the low points, I always find each and every Zelda game to be a unique adventure worth re-exploring, even if that means reliving the hardships along the way. That's it for today's top 10, but thank you so much for watching. You can check out some other Zelda videos that I've done right here, or you can click subscribe to follow for future videos. I'll see you guys next time with more Nintendo content.